Hello everyone, I'm Andrike and in this video I'm going to be showing my very first lightsaber install. This was a bit out of my comfort zone, but I've done enough research to guide myself throughout the whole process. I will do my very best to try and show every step of the process I've done without making it feel drawn out. I'll link everything I have here in the description in case anyone wants to get them. I do not claim that these are the only choices, these are merely the choices I ended up making, so you can adjust according to what you want. I'll be working with the Saberbay Intromnia V2 empty hilt, which was on sale for about $97.50. I placed painter's tape on the hilt to indicate where the pieces should line up by the end of the install. I also have the chassis dedicated for this hilt, which will have the slots to hold everything. The speaker will be hidden by this crystal holder, so this build ended up being more interesting than I thought. Next up is the Proffieboard V3.9 soundboard. This is claimed to be one of the two best soundboards for custom sabers, and I chose this one for its custom capabilities. The Crystal Focus 10 is a bit too expensive for me, so I chose this as the next best thing. The soundboard also came with a microSD card with a lot of included sound fonts, but it's currently not shown since I had it in a separate microSD card reader. Here's the stock CustomWorks NeoPixel V4 hilt side PCB connector, which includes LEDs to show some of that nice color when that blade isn't attached. There are ways of making the Saber include blade detection, but since this was my first time doing a Saber install, and because I wanted to keep it simple, I chose not to include this for myself. This is a bag with the resin crystal, the positive and negative battery tabs, and the NeoPixel buttons. These aren't ordinary buttons since they have NeoPixel accents attached to them, so I had to use both the LEDs to achieve different effects for when the LEDs shine through the hilt's plunger buttons. More on that later. Here's the kill switch for cutting off power when the Saber isn't in use. The copper piece was originally on the hilt, but I unscrewed this piece out since I'll be adding an OLED display. That way we can see the display from the outside. The outside. Oh, speaking of the OLED display, here it is. The cool thing about this is that the display doesn't take up too much power, so adding this on is totally worth it. Then we have the Keep Power 18650 3000 mAh battery. This battery is pretty good for lasting a bit of time while the Saber is in use. I could have gotten a second battery, but I think having one is enough for me. I'll probably consider getting another when I actually go to conventions. This also includes a shrink wrap, which is nice for when you want to disguise the battery, but I chose not to use it. Second to last is the crystal accent LED. Lastly, we have a 28mm 4-ohm 3W X-Bass speaker. This speaker is known to be very loud, so it's going to be a little bad for my ears, but luckily you can change the volume levels to your liking. Alright, moving on to the equipment I'll be using. I have a starter install wire kit from the Saber Armory. This kit includes 22, 28, and 30 gauge wires. The length of these wires is extremely generous, so if you mess up the measurement, you still have plenty to use. There's 2 meters for each 22 gauge wire, and there's 1 meter for each 28 and 30 gauge wire. That'll be about 6.6 feet and 3.3 feet respectively. I ended up using the red 22 gauge wire for the battery positive, kill switch, and NeoPixel connector positive, and the black 22 gauge wire for the battery negative and NeoPixel connector negative. The gray 28 gauge wire was used for the speaker positive and negative, and the rest of the colors were used for the OLED display. All of the 30 gauge wires were used for the buttons and accent LEDs. I have a soldering iron which can adjust temperature accordingly. I'll show which temperature I used when I start soldering parts together. This iron included a conical point tip, which is only useful for tiny pads, but it's not very useful anywhere else. Don't make the same mistake as me. Gotta get a hoof tip for better heat transfer. To pair with the soldering iron, I have a 0.8mm soldering wire, which isn't exactly 60-40 composition, but it's close enough. This has a no clean rosin core, which isn't the best for a clean install, but I was working with what I have. You can get a traditional rosin core soldering wire and pair that with some flux. Next, I have a brass wool soldering iron tip cleaner. This is extremely helpful to clean excess solder off the iron, which will increase the lifetime of your soldering iron. Don't use a damp sponge for cleaning. Sponges actually harm the iron, so avoid them entirely. Here's a wire cutter and stripper, and this one in particular has the correct sizes for stripping specific wires. And lastly, I have tweezers. I didn't put them in the spotlight, but to be fair, it's always been on screen. right at the center. So, whatever. This thing has helped me a lot of times, reaching things in the tightest places to get them in place. However, I suggest having rubber tips on these so you get a better grip. Now that we showed everything we have, let's get started with the install. There wasn't a particular order I started with, but I recommend starting at the bottom of the hilt and moving your way up from there. I made this... That diagram looks really bad. Let me clean that up. I'll just show which wires go where for each part so it's not too cluttered. We'll have to solder these wires in a specific order so none of them get left out in the process. If you forget one, then unfortunately, you'll have to undo whatever you worked on. Before you start soldering, make sure you're in a well-ventilated area where the flux vapors won't accumulate in the room. It's not healthy to breathe in fumes even if you think they smell nice. Just don't do that. I started with the speaker wires. For most speakers, it doesn't matter which side is positive or negative, as long as you connect them to their slots on the board. As I mentioned before, 28 gauge gray wire was used for the speaker. Of course, use whichever color you think works best for your install. I measured the length of the wires depending on the location of the part to the soundboard, and add about 3 inches or 8 centimeters to that. Always measure more than you actually need. When you prepare to solder the wires to the board, you can trim the excess length to make it fit. If the wire is too short, you won't have enough to reach to the board, but as long as you measure more, you don't have to worry. Strip the tip of the wire by a tiny bit. Depending on what you're doing, you can strip more of the wire, but for most connections, you should strip a tiny amount to avoid any weird mishaps. You don't want too much exposure to the wire. We'll have to perform a process called pre-tinning. This involves heating the surface and melting solder onto it. Make sure to pre-tin your iron with solder, clean off the solder with a brass wool, and pre-tin it again. This helps remove oxidation from the iron and improve solder connections. If you have flux, you can add it to the tip of the wire or surface before you pre-tin. Flux makes solder much easier to flow into whichever surface you want. Pre-tin your wire by adding solder to the tip, and then pre-tin the surface of the part you want to make the connection to. Then heat up both the wire tip and surface to solder them together, and ensure the wire makes contact with the surface. The wire should slowly sink into the solder of the surface you pre-tinned. And once the connection is made, pull away your iron quick enough to allow the solder to solidify within a few seconds. If you did this correctly, the connection shouldn't break with a slight tug. From now on, if there's something you need to solder, remember to pre-tin your wires and parts. Next is the NPXL hilt side connector. I placed the pins into the PCB from the back, and then soldered the pins into place. Here comes the tricky part. Depending on what you want your Saber to do, the manual for the connector shows various ways of wiring it. The first one results with a connector with no LEDs, which is boring but power efficient. The second one results with LEDs that will reflect the main blade color. This is the variation I used. The third one results with LEDs that will turn on first and then the blade. This one's extremely confusing, so I prefer not to use this type of data input. Lastly, the fourth one controls the LEDs of the PCB independent from the blade. The color of the LEDs will be different from the blade, and in this way, blade detection can also be set up properly. However, this one is the most complex, so it's not really what I'm aiming for. If you go for any of the variations other than the second one, you must desolder one of the resistors to fit the configuration. Anyways, I soldered the 22 gauge red wire to one of the positive pads of the connector, the 22 gauge black wire to one of the negative pads, and the 30 gauge green wire to the data 2 pad. Keep in mind that you can also use two 24 gauge wires for your two negative pads connection. However, if you are using 22 gauge wire for the negative pads like me, then you have to splice the wire to two wires. These two wires will end up going to the LED 2 and LED 3 slots of the soundboard. I'll just say right now that my mind was making stuff up on the fly, so as a result, I added an additional 22 gauge red wire to another positive pad to connect to the kill switch later. Now you have the buttons. It's extremely tricky to get all these 30 gauge wires to go through their holes in the slots, but it was fine in the end. If you have normal buttons, you can use 28 gauge wires. There are more colors to choose from the wire kit, but because my buttons only accepted 38 gauge wires, I couldn't do it. As a result of that restriction, I had to use 30 gauge red wire for my positive NeoPixel accents and my first button, 30 gauge black wire for my negative NeoPixel accents and button ground, and 30 gauge green wire for my data line and my second button. Both button ground wires can be connected to one wire to connect to the soundboard, and I recommend you do that for your install regardless of what kind of buttons they are. These buttons came with resistors, so I didn't have to worry about adding a 470 ohm resistor to each data line. Again, because of my whole setup, I didn't connect these wires in order. I focused on getting all the NeoPixel positives connected to the positive battery tab. Speaking of NeoPixel positive, I had to connect the crystal accent LED. Normally you would have a 470 ohm resistor for the data line, but I didn't have that. So I used the soundboard's built-in resistor as a way to compensate for it. This datapad could have been used for blade detection, but this would contradict my whole setup if I added it in. Again, I used a 30 gauge red wire for the NeoPixel positive, a 30 gauge black wire for the NeoPixel negative, and a 30 gauge green wire for the data line. You might be wondering, how will I be able to keep track of these wires if most of these wires are the same color? That's the thing. I don't. I'm kidding. I used painter's tape and bundled them up together to remind me which one leads to where. I use a different number of them on each group to know which is which. It's my way of doing it, so if you find yourself in this situation, then you can learn from me. Alternatively, they can be different colors or different patterns of tape to indicate which is which, but I don't have that many varieties. Back to the diagram. Here's the kill switch. Remember that wire I talked about from the NeoPXL connector? I'm connecting that to the leg that is furthest away from the actual switch piece. The reason why is because pushing the switch to the other end will turn on the Saber once everything has been installed. So, if you want the kill switch in a certain orientation, keep this in mind. I prefer my kill switch to be off when it's on the left and on when it's on the right. Sometimes your kill switch can be placed vertically, so it can be flipped down for off and up for on. You can make the choice. Then, I soldered a 22 gauge red wire onto the middle leg of the switch, which will lead to the soundboard. Now I'll be working on the battery tabs. I trimmed the battery tabs at the bottom by slowly rocking the bottom of the tabs back and forth until the metal starts to stress and break with my old wire cutters. Some cutters are capable of cutting straight through this, but I had nothing of that sort, so I used this method. This was the moment where I made the last minute decision to solder the two 22 gauge red wires to the positive battery tab. One of these wires leads to the NeoPXL connector as mentioned earlier, and the other wire serves as a connection for the accent LED's positive wires. The 22 gauge black wire is soldered to the negative battery tab and we're good. The chassis design can influence where you solder your wires to, so I chose to solder my wires at the front of the battery tabs. After that, I glued my battery tabs in place with E6000. Finally, the legendary OLED display will be attached. This is where I used the majority of my 28 gauge wires. The white wire is for SCL, the orange wire is for SDA, the yellow wire is for SD power, and the green wire is for ground. This was the second easiest thing to do apart from the speaker. It's time to solder everything to the soundboard. Except, holy horses! You have to check if you're not missing any connections before you solder everything to the soundboard. Important connections such as the NeoPXL positive, kill switch, and battery tab wires should all be connected to each other once all those parts are in the chassis. If you forget one or all of these things, then you have to undo part of the install, unfortunately. Although, if you're doing a basic install, you shouldn't have to worry about it too much. Just prepare all of the parts for the chassis and you should be good. What I did before soldering the wires to the soundboard was to connect the accent positive wires together to the wire of the battery tab. I also connected the button ground wires together and I spliced the NeoPXL connector negative to two wires to connect to the LED pads. I already mentioned these processes before, but I wanted to mention them here since they're important to do before the wires are soldered to the soundboard. Organize your wires into the chassis. The battery wires, speaker wires, and the accent LED wires hide underneath the battery holder. The button wires and the NPXL connector wires come from the top, while the kill switch wires and the OLED display wires come from below with the rest of the other wires. These wire locations are for my chassis, which means they will be different for you, so be wary of where they should go for your install. Now we can solder all the wires to the soundboard. Before you do so, do not pretend the other end of the wires. If you do, there won't be enough room for a wire to fit through the hole in the board slot. Also, remove your microSD card from the soundboard. People have damaged their microSD card unknowingly during this step, so be sure to take it out. Trim the wires to length to ensure they'll reach the soundboard, but enough length to fit all of the wires to the chassis. Strip the tip of the wire by a tiny bit, and do your best to put the wire into the hole, but not too far to the point where too much of the wire protrudes out. Solder the wire and pad together and give a quick inspection to the wire to make sure the connection is solid. Repeat this for the remaining wires you have. The Saber should be fully installed with a tiny exception. In order for this to be complete, a config file has to be uploaded to the soundboard for the Saber to work properly. I will lead you through the process of how to program a Proffieboard only. Follow the manual of your selected soundboard to know what to do for this step. Sometimes it's very easy with the included firmware, but sometimes it's really complicated like the Proffieboard. Have your microSD card plugged into your computer so you can inspect the contents and save it for the upcoming steps. If your microSD card is empty, then you can download the default files to fill up the space before you start putting in your own sound fonts. Go to the ProffieOS page and download the latest version of the ProffieOS and extract the contents. At the time of this recording, I had version 7.15. Next is to download Arduino. I use the legacy IDE version since that's what Frederick Hub uses. Download the DFU setup if you are a Windows user, but you can skip this if you are on Mac. Run the DFU setup and accept through all the prompts to have your computer recognize the Proffieboard. Download the Proffieboard Arduino plugin on GitHub and extract the contents. Download the voice pack of your choosing for the menu system and extract those contents too. There are different voice options, so click on the audio preview icon and listen to which one sounds best for you.
Main menu.
Main menu.
Main menu.
Main menu. Main menu.
Main menu.
If the microSD card you own already has this voice pack under a common folder or under a different name, then you can skip this step. Take your extracted folder of the voice pack, drag it into your microSD card, and rename the folder to common. Open up Arduino, and once it opens, go to the File tab and click on Preferences. On the side, open up the extracted Proffieboard Arduino plugin folder, open the readme.md file with Notepad, and copy this link here with Ctrl-C. There are instructions listed here to set up the Proffieboard, but that's outdated, so don't follow that and just copy the link shown here. Take that link and paste it into the text box with Ctrl-V for the additional Boards Managers URL section, and click OK once you've completed this step. Now go to the Tools tab and hover to Board, and click on Boards Manager. With the search bar, type in Proffieboard. It may show up within a few letters, so you don't have to type the whole word if you already see it. There are multiple versions you can select for the installation, but install the latest version of the plugin. At the time of this recording, I had version 4.6.0. If it doesn't show this for the drop-down menu, it means you either installed it already, or it means you have to install an older version first, such as 3.6.0, and then reinstall 4.6.0 from the drop-down menu. It shouldn't take too long. Once that's done, you can go down the list of the Tool tab and check your settings. For board, I selected Proffieboard V3. If you have the Proffieboard V2.2, select Proffieboard V2. For USB type, you can select Serial plus Web USB if you are using the board without the microSD card inserted, or you can select Serial plus Mass Storage plus Web USB if you are using the board with the microSD card. I chose the latter since I put the microSD card into the board after I was done soldering the wires to the board. For DOSFS, I selected SD card SDO High Speed. But if you're using a Proffieboard 2.2, select SD card SPI. For CPU, it should be 80 MHz by default, but if it isn't, select it. For Optimize, I selected smallest code. For peripheral clock, I left it as half. For port, I selected the port that had Proffieboard in parentheses. When you first set up your Proffieboard, you may not be able to see it, but don't worry about this since your computer should be able to recognize the Proffieboard once it's plugged in. Here comes the magic. Before you begin, I suggest to make a backup the micro SD card's contents if there is anything inside. That way, if the micro SD card loses the contents, you can back up the files from the folder. Here's the configurator for the Proffieboard. I only grabbed the blade config from this side of the site so I can use it in the FET263 config helper. The blade config from the configurator helps display how many blades will be used. Accent LEDs are also considered in blades, so in my case, I have one main blade and 3 accent blades. It's confusing, but it'll work out. Depending on how long your NeoPixel blade is, you might need to adjust the number of LEDs that will be used in the blade. That way, blade effects can fit throughout the whole blade instead of cutting out somewhere. Same for the accent LEDs. Each button has 2 accent LEDs and the crystal accent LED is just 1. Make sure each blade is connected to their respective slots from the board so they can be read properly. Now, use the helper to customize what you want your Saber to do. Common settings such as gesture controls and special effects can be toggled, so select what you like. Once you're done fiddling with the settings, you can arrive at the presets. You should go to the styles library to get whichever blade style you want, and put in combinations that you desire. Each of these can be selected separately and saved into the using function. Using functions are used to help save memory for when you use the same blade style function for each preset. Since I have accent LEDs, I had to customize the styles for the LEDs as well. Once you prepare your using function, add a preset to add your first selection. Type the name of the font exactly as it's presented in the folder's name in your microSD card contents, and if your font includes a track, put your main track's location in a box. If the font doesn't include a track, then you can select any track from the tracks folder in the microSD card. If you have a using function, you can use the drop-down menu to select the function and use the blade style you created. From here, you can also change parameters to customize the blade color, blade flicker, ignition, retraction, etc. If a specific blade style is not from your using function, you can copy and paste the code of that specific blade style instead. Put the name of the font in the name section to indicate what preset you're using. And if you have an OLED display, use all lowercase letters and use /n to bring the word to the next line. Repeat this process until you're satisfied with the number of presets you'll be using. After that, generate the full config, download it, and make a backup of the file in case you want specific settings to be saved. Put the config file into the ProffieOS config folder in this location, and prepare to plug in your Proffieboard. Before you do so, do not put the battery in the battery holder. You'll blow up your Saber if you plug the soundboard into your computer with it on, so be careful. Also, when you plug in the soundboard, do not move the Saber or soundboard around since this will break the board if it detects too much motion. Use a micro USB data cable, not a charging cable. If you don't know whether the cable you have is fit for this step, then get a cheap data cable online or in store. Now plug in the cable to the soundboard first, and then plug the other end of the cable to the computer. Depending on how the board was set up, you may hear a boot sound that sounds distorted or clean. Either way, this is normal, so proceed with the next step. Since I already configured my Proffieboard before the install happened, my boot sound was clean. With the first line of code highlighted, change the line here by inputting the name of the config file you downloaded. If you have your config name as myconfig, then type that in. But if you renamed it either directly or in the FET263 helper, then use that name instead. Once you confirm that everything is correct, you can verify your file by clicking the check mark on the top left of the window. This will go through the board to verify if there's enough memory for everything. Once the verification is complete, you can upload the file by clicking on the right arrow button next to the check mark. If done correctly, the upload should have a progress bar shown at the bottom of the window. Once the upload is complete, you will hear another boot sound from the Saber. Safely eject the Proffieboard from your computer and go test around with it. However, if the upload was unsuccessful, make sure you have enough memory for the file, and make sure you have the Proffieboard recognized by the computer. As a last resort solution, you can use Zadig and go through that tedious process, but I strongly advise against it since it's time consuming. If something in the code was also interrupting the upload, make sure to check where the error lies by using Notepad, and then save your changes afterward. Assuming everything has been done correctly, you can have fun with your Saber. However, my test runs say otherwise. Alright, test 1 of the Lightsaber install. Now I can put the battery in, and if I activate it, let's hope that it works. I'm never on time anyways. Oh my god! Holy shit! The accent LED is working as intended, but the buttons are currently not working the way they should. Oh no! The negative of the button kind of snapped off already. I will be back. Alright, test 2 of the Lightsaber install. This time I actually connected the button negatives.
That's something.
Yeah, that's definitely working. Yeah, so it's definitely working. The second button is just not willing to work, and I'm gonna have to check out what is happening with that. Let's do this again. Alright, test number 3. But I think I mixed up the data line and the button, which is no good.
That's something.
Oh my god. It works. Oh my god. It's the exact way that I programmed it. The buttons go like this. Oh my god. Oh yeah, this was supposed to be like full Moko font, but I guess it didn't translate well into this. It's such a scuffed font that I made. Yeah, that's it. Alright. After my third test, I was confident enough to declare my Saber install complete. I threaded the rest of the hilt together, made sure my blade was inserted, and messed around with it for many days. I even made a few sound fonts while I was doing my research. Here I made a Fuamoko Baobao sound font, which is free to download in the description. And the other one... yeah, let's not talk about that any further. I had so much fun with this lightsaber install. This was extremely cool to get hands on and understand how each component fits together to make such an elegant weapon for a more civilized age. Civilized age. That's all I have. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'll leave resources, guides, tools, and parts linked in the description below for those who want to start their Saber building journey. If you have any questions, you can comment below your question and I'll see if I can answer it. Otherwise, you can go to the Crucible for your inquiries. I'll also attempt a stunt Saber conversion in the future, so if you want to see that, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on that video. Most of the time I'm uploading content of my streaming journey here on YouTube, so if you want to greet me on Twitch when I'm live, feel free to say hi. I'll be heading out now, so thank you to whoever watched this video, and hope this motivates you to start your very first lightsaber install. I will see everyone next time. Goodbye!